Hello again, it's the Employee of the Month. And I wanted today to respond to a sermon that I did a couple of weeks ago regarding Romans chapter 9. There are actually three of them, but the third one's coming this Sunday, but I wanted to respond to a specific portion of one of them as a question came to me after the sermon, and it was a very good question, and it had to do with what Romans 9 says with regard to how God chooses, how we choose, how God's will works in our lives, all of these questions that are troubling to many people. And I wanted to do the best I could, as the Employee of the Month, obviously, to answer those questions as they seem to me to be quite answerable, and it seems to me also that they're quite biblically answerable. So I want to deal with them. The question came to me with regard to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is the example in this particular text. What does it mean that God hardened Pharaoh's heart? That's a very difficult text to read, because in the text it goes on to describe how there are certain vessels, meaning people, made for honor, and there are certain vessels made for destruction, so that it seems to teach that God is just picking and choosing. So what I want to do is pose three alternatives as a response to the way in which we might interpret biblically God's character to be. And all three of these responses, with exception of the last one, I have been confronted with in my life as a believer by people who really felt like this is the way that God must be based on this text. So, what are the three options? Well, the first option is this. God simply wills everything. He's the maker. He decides everything. Every movement of every being on the earth, every movement of every atom in the universe is scripted. And that no one of us, even we who are sentient, have anything to say about how that script is to be lived out. In other words, any choice we might think we are making is merely illusory. And so, if God has picked some of us to be vessels of destruction, as the text says, then we've nothing to say about that. And it doesn't matter what our heart's desire might be, or how we might make a choice in that spectrum of time. It makes no difference. The script is written. God has decided. There it is. Live it out. And the end comes, and whatever the end within that script happens to be, that's the end for us. Well, this imagery paints a picture of God's character that I find uncomfortable, simply because I look at the character of what we believe to be the greatest revelation of God we have in Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus says, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." His life doesn't reflect this kind of character. This is the kind of character that would go this way by, say, a metaphor. A kid buys a small aquarium and he places all the little parts in there in the sand and whatnot, and he places an insect-eating lizard within the aquarium as a pet. He then goes and picks amongst the millions of opportunities to pick certain flies and certain other flying insects. He pulls their wings off and throws them down into the aquarium with the insect-eating lizard, knowing that now they're subject to their fate with no means of escape. They can't fly anymore, so they just crawl around until the lizard chases them down and eats them. This seems to me to be the kind of character that's being described in that first scenario. I don't see that as in any way the character of God as it is in Scripture. But that is an alternative. That is, and I've been confronted by people who did not believe, who said, well, if this is the God that you have relationship with, count me out. So I have to acknowledge that that is a possibility. Second possibility is the one that is given to us by our Calvinistic friends who believe just as fiercely as we do that Jesus is who he claimed himself to be. However, based on this text, they also extrapolate certain things about how God's will, how God's sovereignty works within the encounter with us. And it works this way, that God from all eternity has known, who knows, all from eternity past to eternity future. He knows within the spectrum of time in there, wherein humanity will occupy the earth, who is going to choose him and who is going to reject him. He knows that already. As a matter of fact, not only does he know it, he has fixed it. And so the person is born into this world. None of us choose that. We're born into a certain part of the world. None of us choose that. That our lives are absolutely picked and chosen as part of a play that God has written the script to. And the lines are fixed and the movements are fixed, and we simply play out those lines and movements within our lifetime. And if we happen to be one of those who is chosen for honor, great. If we happen to be one of those who's chosen for destruction, well, that's just God's choice, and that's the way we have to look at it. That, again, to me, doesn't seem to fit within the spectrum of what God's character would be with regard to the biblical revelation of Jesus. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But what if there's a third option? What if, and this is the option that I've never seen in print, but I would like to post, I'm sure somebody's thought of it before, but as an option to fit God's character into this paradigm, wherein in two places it says, one, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and two, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. What does that mean to say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart? What does it mean? It seems to me it could mean this. What if God encounters Pharaoh? Now, if I look at the text in Exodus, and I see from the time that Moses appears in Pharaoh's court to ask for the Hebrews to be let go as a people, all the way through to the very end of the encounters wherein the sea is parted and the Hebrews cross on dry land and Pharaoh's army is swallowed up, I see encounter after encounter after encounter wherein Pharaoh is encountering the maker of the universe. As a matter of fact, his magicians even tell him so. In Exodus chapter 8, they say to Pharaoh, we can't do anything here. This is far above our pay grade. This is the finger of the maker of the universe. We can't do anything. Which was a dangerous thing for them to say, simply because at that time of Rex Lex, the king is law, they could have lost their lives for having said such a thing. So this encounter and these various encounters as they occur, at each juncture, Pharaoh is afforded the opportunity to either walk toward God as the maker of the universe or to harden his heart and walk away from him. So when the text says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened by God, how does that work? God encountered Pharaoh, and at each point Pharaoh hardened his heart. So was God hardening Pharaoh's heart? Yes. Simply by encountering him, he was hardening his heart. It reminds me of a sort of a scenario one might set up within, say, a family in which you've got a child who, say, doesn't visit the parents very often. Parents are home alone, child has moved away, and then the parents begin to demand of that child that they visit on these certain occasions. Their heart, that child's heart, would become hardened toward their parents by that demand being made. And at each point at which the child acquiesces, the hardening of the heart takes place. Now, I know that's a kind of a rough analogy, but it starts to make some sense of this text. God is encountering Pharaoh, just as he encounters you and me. And at the junctures of encounter, Pharaoh has two options. One, he walks toward God, or two, he walks away from God and hardens his heart. Do the encounters harden Pharaoh's heart? Yes, they do. Now, the next question flows, as our hearts might be hardened by the same type of encounters. The maker of the universe encounters us. Our hearts are molded and moved toward God, or they are hardened and we move away from God in the same way. But the next question flows then, what does it mean here in eternity? This is where I see Calvin as overreaching just a bit, and the other reformers who agreed with him. to say that this means that Pharaoh then is destined for an eternity apart from God. I don't know that, and the text doesn't say it. We don't have any clue what Pharaoh's encounters with the maker of the universe were prior to that encounter with Moses in his court, in Pharaoh's court. We don't know. And we don't know what happened after Pharaoh watched his army swallowed up by the Red Sea. We don't know that either. So in that stretch of time beyond which we have any information, was God encountering Pharaoh? Probably. What was Pharaoh's response to it? We don't know. So a vessel made for destruction, it seems to me that this text is telling us quite clearly that God, yes, he picks people out for certain roles in God's history, and they fulfill those roles based upon God's foreknowledge. Did God foreknow that Pharaoh would harden his heart? Yes, he knew that, but that fits within a spectrum of choices, any of which Pharaoh had the option to make. God knows not only that Pharaoh would harden his heart, he also knows all of the other choices possible for Pharaoh as well. It happens that Pharaoh picked the one that hardened his heart. So God's foreknowledge of that choosing in Pharaoh doesn't make God responsible for Pharaoh's choice, any more than it makes me responsible for my own child's choices, wherein I'm guiding them. They are still making the choices, even though my guidance is there. Pharaoh made his choices even though God was encountering him, and through those encounters, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. This seems to me to make a lot more sense of this text, in that it not only explains how God's activity would harden a heart, it also explains how our choices to allow that to happen are just as much a part of this mix. And it fits perfectly within the paradigm of reality as the Bible portrays it to be. If you look at the Genesis account, whether you look at it as a narrative or you look at it as a metaphor or an allegory, it makes no difference whatsoever to the outcome. The two sentient creatures are set within the sublime surroundings of the garden. However you view this, they are given everything. The whole earth is theirs. They are given one place of hard decision. Don't eat that one. They choose to eat it, and then all of the effects of that choice flow into their lives, into the environment and everything else, and we find the world as it is. How do I know this to be true? I've seen it in another place in Scripture. If you move forward in time, you come to the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a great king. Nebuchadnezzar lived at a time when it was Rex Lex, the king is law. Nebuchadnezzar was prone to dreams. And one of these dreams, he has his court interpreter, Daniel, his wise man, interpret the dream. He gets the interpretation given to him by Daniel, and then he proceeds to live it out. His heart is hardened. He sees his realm. He says, look at what I have done. And he forgets about the dream wherein he finds out that he is going to be forced into insanity, living as a wild animal in the fields for a period of time until his hair is matted and he's no longer the great king. But then he has an awakening and he chooses to bend his knee and say to the God of the universe, you are Lord. He made that choice and God restored him to his kingdom. And Nebuchadnezzar became a follower. So you can see that these choices are real. They aren't just a part of a script that we live out wherein we have nothing to say about it. There is a script, but the script contains a broad spectrum of choosings that we could make along that way. And each time you and I, as we encounter God in our lives, whether we believe in Him or not, we are given those opportunities to either choose to have our hearts softened and walk toward God, or to choose by those encounters to have our hearts hardened and we choose to walk away from God. This makes sense of this text to me with regard to the intersection of our choices and God's choices. Does God make choices? Yes, He does. Do we make choices? Yes, we do. Are they both real? Yes, they are. It is not an illusion wherein the script is just there and we think we are making real choices. They are actual. and they fit within that whole spectrum of choosings that we might make, that God already knows all of them. We pick the one, and it either moves us toward Him and a softening of our hearts, or away from Him and a hardening of our hearts. I'm the Employee of the Month. I hope this helps with this text. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.